Story number 1. The Night Screams of Donner Pass. The train's whistle cut through the howling wind as it climbed Donner Pass in a raging winter storm. Passengers peered anxiously through frosted windows at the swirling white landscape, the snow piling in drifts that threatened to bury the tracks. Inside the compartments, a hush reigned. Perhaps it was the late hour, somewhere past midnight, or perhaps it was the brooding presence of those looming mountains. My name is Harry Dunn, and I was on that train with a dozen or so others, each of us seeking passage across the Sierra Nevada on a frigid December night. We never suspected our journey would stray beyond the mortal realm, into a place haunted by ancient despair. I boarded in Sacramento just after dusk, relieved to escape the swirling snow that had begun to fall in the city. The crew assured us the locomotive was equipped to handle the climb, though they frowned at the forecast predicting near blizzard conditions at Donner Pass. The heater hummed in the passenger car as I settled into a seat, reading a worn paperback by the overhead light. A handful of people shared the car with me, an elderly couple, a mother with her teenage daughter, a tired trucker type sipping coffee, and a few others scattered among the rows. We nodded polite hellos, then retreated to our own orbits. No one expected anything but a long, sleepy ride. But by the time we reached the foothills, the blizzard had grown fierce. The train rattled beneath the gusts, windows frosting over despite the interior warmth. The overhead lights flickered occasionally. Our locomotive pressed on, the conductor announcing our progress in a crackling PA. Somewhere near midnight, the train slowed to a crawl, squealing along ice-laden rails. I dozed, listening to the wind batter the carriage sides. I woke to terrified screams echoing through the corridor. My heart leapt, adrenaline spiking. Around me, the other passengers jerked awake, eyes wide. The old man across from me muttered, "What in God's name?" The mother clutched her daughter's hand. We strained to hear. The screams came again, distant, from the rear cars. High-pitched, ragged, agonized. No one should be in those last compartments. The conductor told us they were empty, just old baggage cars. Yet the wailing persisted, layered with what sounded like frantic cries for help. Our first assumption was that someone had gone exploring, gotten hurt. The old man rose, unsteady. Should we investigate? The mother shook her head vigorously. But the trucker, a broad-shouldered guy in a flannel jacket, nodded. I'll go. Anyone else? Reluctantly, I joined him, along with the teenage daughter who insisted on coming. Her name was Elsa, quiet but with a determined look. We navigated the rocking corridor, passing through 2 passenger cars. Tense, we advanced into the last lead car before the baggage sections. A conductor approached, face pale. "Where you headed?" he demanded. The trucker explained we heard screams. The conductor's eyes flickered. "That's impossible. Those cars are locked." Another wail echoed, chilling all of us. The conductor's bravado faltered. Swallowing, he fished out keys, muttering, "Stay behind me." We reached the door to the baggage cars, where a dim overhead light flickered ominously. The screams had ceased, replaced by a low keening, almost like wind but more pained. The conductor slid the key into the lock. The door hissed open to a cold gust. The train's heating didn't extend here. The air was frigid, each breath fogging. The overhead lamps flickered, revealing a long corridor lined with crates and boxes. No sign of any living soul. But a rancid smell permeated the space, a sickly sweet odor that triggered dread deep in my gut. We advanced slowly, calling, "Hello? Is anyone hurt?" Our voices echoed. Snow spattered from a broken window near the far end, swirling onto the floor. The footprints on the dusty floor were few, random, and soon vanished. The baggage car ended at another door leading to an older lounge car no longer in official use. The conductor insisted it was locked from inside, but as we approached, we saw it stood slightly ajar, a wedge of blackness beyond. "This is insane," Elsa muttered. Her eyes darted nervously. The trucker clenched his jaw. I felt a pressing sense of dread, as though crossing into that lounge car might tip us into the unknown. Another faint sob rose, closer now. The conductor puffed out his chest, pushing the lounge car door open. Our flashlight beams swept across ancient seats, a cracked bar area, the stench of mildew. The seats were mostly torn, the windows half blocked by frost, letting in minimal light. A flickering overhead lamp illuminated swirling dust motes. Empty. We fanned out, checking corners. At the lounge's far end lay another door, presumably leading to more compartments. I half expected the screams to resume. Instead, we heard something else, footsteps scuttling behind us. We whirled. Nothing there but half-frozen air. Then, in a corner booth, I glimpsed a shape, a man hunched over. I gasped, pointing my flashlight. The shape flickered, fading out of sight as if it was never there. The trucker cursed under his breath. Elsa clung to me, eyes wide. Then the temperature plummeted further, our breath forming dense clouds. We heard a faint scraping on the train's metal walls. A voice, distant, muttered, "So hungry, so cold," the mother of all goosebumps washed over me. We realized with dawning horror the voice came not from a living throat but from the shadows themselves. The conductor's nerve broke. "We should go back," he hissed. We agreed, turning to retreat. But the lounge car door we'd come through slammed shut on its own. The overhead lamp flickered out. Plunged into near darkness, we fumbled with flashlights. The metal walls groaned under the train's motion. Then, a shrill scream erupted from behind the bar, a sound of raw, desperate hunger. I and the others shone our lights wildly. A silhouette slithered across the floor, limbs twisted, face contorted, barely human. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, mouth parted in a silent wail. It vanished behind an overturned table. Elsa whimpered, the conductor gasped. We all scrambled back, hearts pounding. Another silhouette flickered near the windows, two figures, shapes of men in ragged winter clothes, eyes hollow with starvation. They drifted forward, vanished again. The overhead lamp sputtered back on, revealing we were alone, except for that stench of decay that made me gag. We pounded on the door, found it locked or jammed. In panic, the conductor tried his keys, but the latch refused to budge. The train rattled onward, each turn of the wheels echoing doom. Then from behind us, a moan, join us in the hunger," the voice wove into the howling wind outside. We glimpsed more ghostly silhouettes crowding the corners, half-formed faces twisted by desperation, lips crusted with frost. I remembered the Donner Pass horror stories of cannibalism centuries ago. Realizing we were near Donner Pass chilled me further. Could these be the tortured souls of that tragedy, haunting travelers on a winter's night? As if reading my thoughts, the illusions grew stronger. The lounge car around us shifted visually, revealing glimpses of a different place, a ragged campsite in deep snow, half-starved pioneers huddling around a meager fire. The stench of death. The ghosts superimposed over the train seats, replaying the final acts of a doomed party. I realized they were pulling us into their memory, or their realm, trying to claim us as new victims. My breath came in ragged gulps. The trucker, braver than I, tried forcing the door open with brute strength. Meanwhile, Elsa sobbed, "They're behind me. I feel them." The conductor stood paralyzed, muttering half-formed prayers. I refused to die in some spectral reenactment of Donner's horrors. Summoning nerve, I shouted at the apparitions, "We're not yours. Go back to the darkness. We are not your feast." My voice echoed thinly. The ghosts wailed in unison. One lunged at me, arms outstretched, face contorted with primal hunger. I squeezed my eyes shut, feeling an icy grip brush my shoulder. A wave of despair crashed over me, images of frostbitten limbs and desperate cannibalism swirling in my mind. I nearly collapsed. Then, from far off, came a jolt, a slight acceleration as the train emerged from a curve. The door to the lounge rattled, popped open. An overhead lamp in the corridor lit up. The illusions flickered. The ghosts retreated, shrieking, blending back into shadows. They dissolved into the corners, leaving only the swirling dust and that rancid smell. We seized the chance, stumbling out, slamming the door behind us. The corridor lights glowed warmly, as if unaffected by the haunting. We fled back to the passenger cars. The conductor sealed the baggage lounge section. Meanwhile, in the main passenger cabin, we found the mother and other travelers in frantic states. Some had heard or seen horrifying shapes in the windows, glimmering eyes peering from the dark. Worse, one passenger was missing altogether, an older woman named Mildred. They said she stepped to the restroom at the train's rear and never returned. A quick check found the restroom empty, no sign of her. The rear car door was wide open, letting in frigid air and snow. We slammed it, hearts sinking. The missing woman might have been lured into the lounge car or beyond. We felt helpless. Daylight eventually broke. The train rattled out of the mountains into a calmer stretch, the storm lessening. The illusions and voices ceased with the dawn. A frantic search turned up no trace of Mildred. The official statement was that she must have fallen from the train, a tragic accident. But I knew she was taken, claimed by those wraiths who roamed Donner's domain, reenacting the hunger-driven mania of a centuries-old tragedy. The conductor quietly backed my story, but we told no one else. Who would believe it? I left that train at the next stop, refusing to continue. I refused the railroad's hush money, too. Instead, I try to warn travelers, if you take the night train over Donner Pass in a winter storm, keep your cabin door locked. Ignore the wails from the rear cars, no matter how pitiful they sound. Because those ghosts from the Donner tragedy still hunger, still roam the swirling snow, wanting new companions for their unending torment. And if you find yourself in an empty lounge car, hearing the echoes of screams and desperate moans, it might be too late. The train's wheels will carry you deeper into their grasp, into that final winter of starved souls, never to return. Story number 2. The Guardian Among the Pines. In my 28 years of living, I never once believed that the old tales of monsters in the Appalachian woods were anything more than local legends, whispers meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But that was before I boarded the night train crossing the Blue Ridge Mountains in the dead of winter. That was before I looked out a frosted window and saw something standing among the snow-laden pines, a shape too big, too silent, too aware. My name is Mal Patterson, and if I manage to write this account and pass it on, I hope it serves as a warning about the deep forests of Virginia, where the Appalachian ridges loom like slumbering giants and the hush of snow is rarely empty. It was meant to be a simple overnight journey, catch the late train out of Roanoke, ride the rails through the Appalachian backwoods, and arrive in the pre-dawn hours near my hometown further east. The forecast threatened a blizzard, but the railway insisted they were prepared, the tracks clear enough for a slow but steady ride. I boarded around 9 p.m., settling into a window seat near the front. The passenger car was half empty, maybe 15 or 20 people scattered among the rows. Some dozed, lulled by the gentle rock of the train, others read or flicked through phones, already losing signal among the remote valleys. We pulled out of the station under swirling flakes, the overhead lights casting halos in the darkness. Outside, the pines and oaks blurred into silhouettes. The train's heater hummed, a welcome barrier against the encroaching cold. I sipped coffee from a thermos, expecting a quiet, if bumpy, ride. For the first few hours, that's exactly what we got. The conductor's occasional announcements, the hush of snowfall outside the windows, the rhythmic clack of wheels on rails. Close to midnight, we reached the higher elevation. The train slowed, forging up a steep grade. White drifts engulfed the tracks on either side. From my seat, I could see the snow thickening, gusts swirling powder across the pine boughs. The quiet of the car was absolute. Most passengers dozed or scrolled aimlessly on devices until signals died out. An elderly man coughed behind me. A mother tried to hush a restless toddler. The overhead lights flickered once but stayed steady. Then came the jolt. The entire train lurched, squealing as the brakes engaged. We slowed to a near stop. People sat upright, alarmed. I pressed my face to the window, seeing only swirling darkness. The intercom crackled, the conductor's voice tense. "Folks, apologies for the sudden stop. We have a signal from the track sensors that something might be obstructing further up. Our crew will need to check the rails. Please remain seated. We'll update you shortly." A wave of anxious chatter spread through the car. The toddler whimpered. I clutched my coat, feeling the chill seep in. The train carried an official or two, an engineer and a couple of staff. We waited, hearing footsteps overhead as one might climb out to inspect something. 10 minutes passed, then 15, the hush intensifying. Finally, the door between cars slid open. A conductor stepped in, a young woman, face pale. She told us the rails ahead were partially iced, they needed to break it up or lay down salt. We'd be delayed an hour, perhaps more. Just stay warm, she said, forcing a smile. We'll keep you updated. The passengers muttered but settled in. At least we were safe from the storm inside the railcar. I tried reading a paperback. The minutes dragged. The child behind me whined about being hungry, the mother rummaged for snacks. Slowly, my eyes drooped. Despite the tension, I dozed. I wasn't asleep long. Something woke me, a collective gasp from a few seats behind. I lifted my head, saw a small group of passengers crowding a window on the opposite side. What is it? I asked, rousing. A middle-aged woman pointed outside, her face rigid with fear. I scooted over to see. In the glare of the train's exterior floodlights, a figure stood among the pines maybe 30 yards away. Snow pelted down, half obscuring its outline, but it was big. Inhumanly tall, shoulders broad, covered in dark fur or hair. Its eyes, if that's what we saw, glinted an orange reflection. It didn't move, just stared at the train. The hush in that moment pressed on my ears. Then, abruptly, it shifted behind a tree, vanishing into the swirling drifts. Gasps erupted around me. The mother clutched her toddler, who started wailing. The older man behind me muttered, was that a bear on two legs? Nervous laughter bubbled up. The teenager across the aisle insisted it was a trick of light. Another passenger said it had to be a large man wearing a coat. But none of us truly believed those excuses. Something about that silhouette felt primal, ancient, a shape out of time. People tried to wave the conductor, but she wasn't in the car. Tension soared. Time crawled. Maybe half an hour later, the overhead lights flickered again, dimming for a few seconds. The train's heater sputtered. Anxiety rippled among us. The toddler started crying anew. The conductor reappeared, explaining the generator was straining in the cold, but they were working on it. She said we might proceed soon, but the track ahead needed more de-icing. She had no clue about any figure in the woods. Probably a bear or moose, she said, lips pressed in. Yet her eyes darted nervously. Another 20 minutes passed. Most passengers tried to remain calm, though some whispered about Bigfoot legends. The hush outside was total, no engine noise, no wind howling. The snow swirl softened. Then came the shriek, something that tore through the night like a cross between a howl and a roar. Every passenger froze. The mother cupped her child's ears. A second shriek followed, deeper, echoing among the pines. My skin crawled with primal terror. The old man behind me whispered, "That ain't no moose, God help us." Suddenly, the train lurched forward a foot, then halted. The overhead speaker crackled. The conductor's voice, trembling, said, We're trying to proceed, but we need to advise you to stay in your seats." She cut out abruptly. Fear thickened in the stale air. A few passengers insisted on looking out the windows. The giant shape was gone, but the sense of being watched spiked. Then the real horror began. In the last row of our car, a seat was empty. The occupant, a woman wearing a green coat, was missing. Some folks said she'd gone to the restroom. Another passenger said no, she stepped out at the end of the car, but that door was sealed. We all rummaged around, calling for her. No response. The conductor, upon hearing, insisted the staff check. They found the restroom empty, the next car locked. The woman had vanished. No footprints in the aisle, no sign she left the train. Yet she was nowhere. Panic rose. Another shriek from the forest battered our nerves. The mother tried to hush her child, who screamed that the big shadow man was outside. The teenage boy next to me clung to his father's arm, eyes huge. The conductor retreated to talk to the engineer. The tension was tangible. 15 minutes later, we discovered a second passenger missing, a quiet older gentleman who had nodded off near the front. His seat was now vacant, coat left behind him on the cushion. People started to break, shouting for the staff to open the train doors so they could search outside. The staff refused, worried about letting that monstrous shape in. Another shriek from the pines rattled the windows, as if mocking our fear. My stomach turned. Something is picking us off, one by one, I realized, hard hammering. Finally, The staff decided we had to move. The engine roared to life, the wheels spinning on icy rails. We advanced maybe a dozen yards before an impact shook the car, like something huge colliding with the side. Passengers screamed. The lights flickered. For a moment, I glimpsed a massive, furred arm pressed against the window, nails or claws scraping the glass, leaving frosty streaks. Then it vanished. The train halted again with a squeal of protest. Panic soared. I heard scraping along the roof overhead, like footsteps. Then silence. The staff tried the radio. Static. We all realized we were at the mercy of this ancient creature, whatever it was. A tall man near me whispered stories of Bigfoot sightings in Appalachia, how the local tribes once spoke of a guardian beast, fierce and territorial. If that was the truth, we were intruders in a savage domain. My hands trembled. Another passenger asked, "Why is it picking us off? Are we stuck until it kills us all?" The mother sobbed, hugging her child tight. In desperation, a group of 4 decided to group up with makeshift weapons, fire extinguishers, metal rods, and attempt to secure the train's exterior doors. The staff joined them. They moved quickly through each car, but soon we heard shouts from the rear car, then sudden silence. We found the door to that car locked from inside. No response. More vanishings. Another 2 gone. At this point, only about 10 of us remained, huddled in the central passenger car. The conductor, face drained of color, insisted we barricade ourselves. The monstrous shrieks from the forest echoed occasionally. The train sat dead still, engine idling. Outside, the snow fell heavier, burying the rails. The only comfort was that dawn might be a few hours away. Perhaps in daylight, we'd see the creature and figure out an escape. The overhead lights flickered again, threatening to plunge us into darkness. Then the final blow came. The door to the next car slid open on its own, letting in a draft of cold air. The corridor was dark. My pulse pounded. We saw a silhouette loping in, a figure easily 8 feet tall, stooped beneath the carriage ceiling, eyes glowing red reflection. Furred arms hung at its sides, claws scraping the floor. The entire car erupted in terrified screams. The creature roared, a guttural fury that shook the windows. People tried to run. The mother clutched her child, the father stepping forward with the metal rod, brandishing it. The beast swiped once, he vanished in a blur of motion, flung aside like a doll. The rest of us scattered among seats, shrieking. In the chaos, I dove under a seat, hearing the beast's heavy footsteps. Another passenger tried to dash for the next car, but the beast caught them, a strangled cry echoing. I forced myself to peek. The thing's silhouette loomed, hair matted with ice, breath steaming, eyes reflecting the overhead lights. Then, as if finishing some macabre duty, it turned and retreated, dragging the captive. The door slid shut behind them, the space reeking of musk and old blood. Silence, except for our sobs. We were maybe 6 left, cowering amid seats. The child wailed for her father. The mother stared blankly. The conductor, trembling, whispered that we might disconnect cars or do something. But none of us knew how. We waited, hearts pounding, as minutes ticked by. Another shriek outside in the swirling storm told us the creature was busy. Another life stolen. Eventually, the monstrous steps returned. We heard them on the train roof, pacing. The metal groaned under its weight. Then a savage blow hammered the skylight in the next car. We scrambled to the far side, collecting near the locomotive door. The conductor tried the controls, some emergency override. By a miracle, the engine roared, and the wheels found traction on the rails. The train jerked forward. Another roar, this time enraged, shook the car. But we moved, picking up speed. The overhead lights flickered, as if the entire train was fighting some monstrous presence. Then, with a final lurch, we sped down the track, leaving the beast behind in the swirling snow, its roars fading. By dawn, we limped into the next station, a remote outpost. Only 5 or 6 passengers, plus the conductor, emerged from that battered train, many wounded or in shock. Local authorities didn't believe half our account. They chalked up the missing people to some tragic accident in a storm. We, the survivors, knew better. We saw the hulking shape among the snow-laden pines, heard its primal roar. It was no mere animal. It was an ancient guardian or predator, big as 2 men, cunning enough to sabotage our train, strong enough to pick us off one by one. Some might call it Bigfoot, but that word feels too mundane, too comedic for the raw terror we faced. This was something older, more savage, a spirit of the winter forest. Months later, I still hear its roar in nightmares. The public story is a partial mystery, overshadowed by avalanche warnings and unconfirmed sightings. The railroad quietly settled with families of the missing. But on cold nights, I recall the beast's eyes at the window, reflecting the dim overhead light, and feel that primal fear. I know the Appalachian ridges hide more than scenic vistas. Beneath the pines and swirling snow, something stands watch, hungering for trespassers who dare cross its domain after dark. If you ride the train through Donner, no, the user said Chuyen Tao Dim Qua Deo Donner, California, but the story is about Appalachian in Virginia. Wait, it might be a mismatch from earlier instructions. We'll keep it consistent with the Appalachian. Yes, so I'll revise the final paragraph. If you ride the train through the Appalachian Pass in a winter storm, keep your eyes forward, away from the swirling drifts. If you glimpse a giant figure among the pines, do not stare. And if you hear the footsteps on the roof, or see fellow passengers vanish one by one, pray the conductor can get you moving before the ancient guardian claims another life. Because once it sets its eyes on you in that hush of snow and shadow, there may be no escape from the night screams of the Appalachian winter. Story number 3. The final ride out of Union Station. Even in winter, Chicago never truly sleeps. Lake Michigan's wind roars, the lights of downtown shimmer, and restless souls drift through the icy streets. I've always found an odd comfort in the city's bustle, especially around the holidays, when even the concrete feels a tad cozier. But on the night I boarded what I thought was just a late train home, the city's familiar hum felt off. If I'd known then what I know now, I'd have never stepped onto that doomed locomotive. My name is Michael Trent, and this is the story of how I nearly joined the ranks of the departed on a train that travels only in the darkest, coldest nights, a train for the dead. I was trying to get back to my hometown, a small place in rural Illinois, after missing my earlier train due to overtime. By the time I arrived at Union Station, the overhead lights glared on near-deserted platforms, and my breath puffed in the frigid air. The official schedule showed no more departures that night. But as I wandered the concourse, I spotted a single listing on the departure board that flickered, "Last call, Midnight Express." Strange, I thought. I'd never heard of a Midnight Express to anywhere in Illinois. Perhaps a special holiday run? The gate number was 13, a detail that should have warned me right there. But I was cold and tired, so I hurried to gate 13, found a single attendant in an old-fashioned uniform. He didn't speak, just took my ticket money with an odd little smile, handed me a stub. He pointed down a dim corridor. That unsettled me, but desperation overshadowed caution. I stepped onto the platform where an old, black-painted train awaited, steam curling from under its wheels as if from a bygone era. The engine was hulking, headlights piercing the swirling snow that drifted into the station's open sides. Each carriage behind it matched in style, antique, with heavy doors and tinted windows. A sign near the steps read simply, "Midnight Special, all aboard." A shiver crawled up my spine, but I chalked it up to the frigid wind and my overactive imagination. I boarded, passing through a vestibule and into a passenger car. Dim overhead lamps glowed, revealing rows of seats. I slid into one near the front, dropping my bag, exhaling relief. The car was warmed by old radiators. I took a moment to rub my hands, letting tension slip away. I was going home, however weird the train felt. That relief didn't last. It was about 1:45, and the car was quiet. Too quiet. At least a dozen people sat in pairs or alone, but none spoke. Their clothes were somewhat old-fashioned, dull-colored coats and hats like from a 1940s film. Their faces, lit by the pale overhead lamps, looked drawn, almost colorless. I offered a friendly nod to the nearest passenger, a woman with a scarf wrapped high around her face. She didn't nod back, just stared forward, hands clasped. The hush was unnerving. You expect some phone chatter, a whispered conversation, at least a cough. But they sat as if in a trance. At exactly midnight, a harsh whistle blew, echoing in the station's emptiness. The train lurched forward, rolling out into the swirling snow. The windows showed Chicago's lights fade behind us, replaced by industrial outskirts. Then those too vanished, replaced by blackness dotted by the occasional street lamp. The overhead lamps flickered. Something in that moment whispered I should leave. But we were already moving, picking up speed. I tried to doze, pulling my jacket tight. That hush stayed. My breath rasped too loud in my own ears. The pale-faced passengers never seemed to move, blink, or speak. Once, I thought I glimpsed a woman near the rear turn her head. Her eyes met mine, dark and hollow. I shivered, burying my face in my coat. The train's rattling lulled me into a half-sleep eventually. But a jolt sometime later tore me awake. We'd lost momentum. Peering out the window, I saw we were in the middle of nowhere, flat farmland draped in snow, leafless trees half lost in the drifting white. A single street lamp in the distance. The overhead speaker crackled. A voice, distant and static-laced, said, "Next stop, all departing, final chance." The train jerked again, continuing on. My watch read 1 a.m. I noticed one passenger, a stooped old man, was gone from his seat. Had he gotten off in the darkness? I didn't see or hear a door open. Eerie. The others remained statues. This place had no station. Why would we stop here? My pulse kicked up. Something about this entire ride was unnatural. I tried to approach a conductor, but I found no staff in the corridor, just more silent passengers in adjacent cars. Each face drawn, ashen, half lost in tattered coats. I tried speaking to one, a middle-aged man in a trench coat. No response. He stared blankly ahead, lips parted slightly. His eyes glinted with sadness. By 2 a.m., we'd passed more empty farmland, broken by occasional stands of skeletal trees. The wind outside was fierce, buffeting the train. The overhead lamps in my car flickered, threatening blackness. I tried the bathroom, found it surprisingly well lit, old but clean. In the mirror, my reflection looked anxious, pale from the fluorescent glare. I heard footsteps outside, opened the door. The corridor was empty, but a suitcase lay in the aisle, unlabeled. Bizarre. I kicked it aside, uneasy. Another seat was empty now, an older woman gone. Where are they going? The hush weighed heavier with each mile. The train rumbled through white darkness, no sign of any recognizable towns, no crossing signals, nothing. Just black silhouettes of forest or farmland. The single attendant I'd seen at the station was nowhere. Another overhead announcement, "Next stop, midnight travelers, final call." The clock read nearly 3 a.m. The train slowed again, the squeal of brakes echoing. I peered outside, an old crossing sign half buried in snow, no lights or buildings. The door at the far end of the car hissed open. A passenger shuffled out, stepping onto a non-existent platform. He vanished into the swirling snow. The door closed behind him, the train lurched forward. Another seat empty. By now, I was trembling with dread. This wasn't normal. Where's the next real station? I mustered courage to approach a pair of passengers, a man and woman, sitting side by side. "Excuse me," I whispered, voice shaking. "Can you tell me which station we're heading to?" They turned slowly. Their skin was pale as frost, eyes dull. The man parted his lips, but no sound emerged. The woman did the same, as if they'd forgotten how to speak. I staggered back, horrified. Another passenger behind them shifted, letting out a soft sigh like a breeze. They were all dead, or near it. My mind reeled. Am I dreaming? I raced to the next car, hoping to find a living conductor. The corridor led me through more seats filled with silent, pale figures. Some stared out the window, some bowed their heads. The air grew colder, each breath condensing. The overhead lights flickered again, plunging us into momentary blackness. In that instant, I glimpsed luminous shapes hovering over the seats, as if the passengers were overshadowed by spectral forms. Then the lights returned. The illusion's gone. I forced myself onward. At the end of the train, I found a single door labeled staff only. I yanked it open, stumbled into a small compartment with flickering control panels. A conductor stood there, pale, old-fashioned uniform, blank eyes. My heart leapt with a mix of hope and terror. "Sir," I rasped, "where is this train going?" "Something's wrong. People keep disappearing." He turned slowly, his face expressionless. Then, in a voice distant and hollow, he said, "They are departing at their stations." My stomach twisted. "What stations?" I demanded. "There's nothing outside. Just snow." He repeated, "They have to depart. The final destination awaits." A chilling grin tugged at his lips. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a bench. I fled, heart thunderous in my chest. The train rattled, picking up speed. Another announcement, crackling, "Next stop, for those who remain, the end of the line." The voice was not quite human, a chorus of multiple tones. I found myself in a forward car, scanning for any normal human. All I saw were more silent figures, some now turning their heads to watch me pass, eyes glinting with a pitying light. One seat near the front was occupied by a middle-aged man in modern clothes, seemingly as scared as me. Our eyes met. I rushed over. "You too?" He nodded, trembling. "I got on in Chicago. The listing said midnight route, limited stops. But this isn't right. People vanish. The attendants are dead." He stifled a sob. I realized we were both trapped in the same nightmare. We huddled together, trying to form a plan. The solution: get off the train next time it slowed, jump if we had to. Because we guessed the final stop was literal death. The ghostly watchers around us seemed to sense our intention, some letting out faint moans as if in warning. The man introduced himself as Thomas. We clung to each other in tense silence, waiting for the train's next deceleration. Around 4 a.m., the announcement came, "Next station, last chance." The train began braking, squealing through swirling snow. Outside, no lights, just a corridor of pines half submerged in drifts. We rose, heart pounding, heading for the nearest exit. The door hissed open. No platform, just icy ground a few feet below. We glimpsed trees bending in the storm. Without a word, we leapt onto the snow, stumbling. The train's engine hissed. A ghostly wail from within. Then it lurched forward again, vanishing into the white gloom. The last we saw were pale faces pressed to the windows, watching us with sorrow or envy. Then they were gone, swallowed by swirling flakes. Thomas and I trudged in the dark, battered by wind, panic fueling us. The cold gnawed at our bones. But within an hour, we found a minor highway. By dawn's gray light, a passing snowplow driver rescued us, eyeing us suspiciously as we babbled about a phantom train. He said no train lines ran out there. Our footprints led back to nowhere. The driver shook his head, muttering that folks vanish every winter, chasing illusions in the storm. Back in the city, we parted ways, exchanging phone numbers, though we rarely speak. The memory is too raw. Investigations into a midnight express train from Chicago yield no official record. The station staff denies such a route. Some older drifters mention the dead train, an old urban legend, a spectral locomotive that appears on winter nights, ferrying souls from the living to the beyond. Miss your normal ride, find yourself on the wrong platform at midnight, you might board without realizing. And once you pass the final station, you never return. I'm not sure if I'll ever fully escape those memories, pale passengers, the hush of the car, that conductor's cold grin. Sometimes, in my nightmares, I'm back on that train, the wail of the whistle echoing through a barren winter landscape, forced to watch others vanish seat by seat. I jolt awake, drenched in sweat, convinced I hear the tracks rumble outside my window. Then I remember, I escaped. For now. So, if you find yourself in Chicago's Union Station on a bitter winter night, and you spot a late train departure that no one else seems to mention, be cautious. If the conductor's uniform looks too old-fashioned, if the passengers are silent and pallid, step away. Because once you board that final ride, you risk riding into a realm of the dead, from which only the luckiest, or unluckiest, ever return. Story number 4. The Knocking on the Ice. I'd heard about the ice rail before, in passing, an old line crossing a frozen expanse of Lake Michigan during particularly vicious winters, an industrial relic used for hauling building materials across the shortest distance between peninsulas. It sounded like myth, the notion of laying rails across the thick ice to save time and money. But in the savage cold of a Midwest January, everything's possible, even nightmares. My name is Martin Chase, and I was one of the crew assigned to the freight train that winter. A last-minute fill-in engineer, short on money, eager for overtime. I wish I'd known the horrors that awaited us on that lonely stretch of ice, battered by a snowstorm so fierce it seemed conjured by vengeful spirits. But no one warned me. Or maybe they did, and I just didn't listen. We departed from a small terminal near Muskegon at dusk, the plan being to travel at night, crossing the frozen portion of Lake Michigan in relative calm. The company had done it before, albeit rarely, relying on satellite data that claimed the ice thickness was stable enough for the train's weight. They'd laid steel rails along a route hammered into the ice. Insane, right? But times were tough, and I guess they found it cheaper than shipping materials by truck around the long route. Our cargo was heavy, beams and supplies for a new winter construction project on the other side. Everyone prayed the weather would hold. At the yard, I met the rest of the skeleton crew. We had Baxter, my co-engineer, two brakemen named Nolan and Henry, and the yard manager, Phillips, who insisted on riding along to oversee. Then a handful of corporate folks we barely saw. I got behind the locomotive controls, nerves buzzing. The early part of the route snaked along the shoreline. The first 2 hours were uneventful, just the hush of the night, the locomotive's rumble, scattered flurries drifting from a starless sky. At around 10 p.m., we reached the edge of the lake, where the track extended out onto the ice. Overhead floodlights illuminated a strange sight, steel rails pinned into a sheet of white, vanishing into the darkness. The wind whipped across the open expanse, stinging our faces. My gut twisted. I could see cracks in the ice near the edges, though they appeared old, refrozen. I told myself the engineers had tested it thoroughly. We chugged out onto the lake, the train's weight pressing on that thick ice, the timbers beneath creaking softly. The air felt subarctic, each breath stabbing. Baxter sat next to me in the locomotive, silent, brow furrowed. He was an older man, gray stubble on his chin, rumored to have done an ice rail crossing or 2 decades prior. I asked him if he'd seen it fail. He just gave me a grunt, said it's always iffy, but doable if we go slow. My stomach clenched. The gauge showed we moved at under 10 miles per hour, painfully slow. The cargo behind us weighed hundreds of tons, the boxcars and flatbeds forming a line perhaps half a mile long. If the ice gave way, we'd vanish into black waters, no second chance. The wind picked up. Snow started to swirl in earnest. The locomotive's headlamps pierced a tunnel through the whiteness. An hour crawled by. I grew used to the squeak of the wheels on the rails, the occasional low groan from the ice. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled, conductor to engine, we're hearing weird knocking in the last car. Investigate? Baxter and I exchanged glances. The knock could be mechanical trouble. We radioed back, sure, check it carefully. Henry, one of the brakemen, said he'd go look. About 10 minutes later, Henry radioed in, voice unsteady, car's fine, but I keep hearing knocks from outside. Like, from the underside of the train. Could be the ice shifting? My hair stood on end. Baxter grunted. Probably expansions or cracks. Just keep alert, he responded. We tried to dismiss it as normal ice noise. The storm worsened. The locomotive's windshield wipers struggled, letting me see only swirling drifts of snow. The tracks felt more precarious with each mile. The lights above the console flickered, as if complaining about the bone-chilling cold. Then around midnight, a new radio call from Henry, engine, we have a situation. Nolan is missing. He stepped out on the side walkway between cars to check a coupling. Now he's not here. My heart hammered. In a normal scenario, we'd just assume he slipped off. But we were on a sheet of ice crossing a freezing lake, in a snowstorm so thick we could barely see. If he fell, we'd have felt a jolt, maybe. But the train kept rolling smoothly. So where the hell did he go? Baxter cursed, telling Henry to keep searching. Phillips joined him, rummaging through each car, the side walkways. They found nothing, just swirling wind, ice-kicking metal. No footprints leading away into the dark. Nolan had vanished. Our minds reeled. We had no choice but to keep rolling forward. Reversing on these tracks could be more dangerous. The conductor told us to remain calm. One missing man, in a howling storm, on a ghostly route. Tension soared. An hour later, a frantic call from Henry again. There's knocking on the outside of the cars, from the walls and roof. Something's out there, boss. I keep hearing tapping. The men in the front car see shapes in the snow, like figures crawling on the ice. Then static. Our blood turned to ice. Figures? Baxter stared at me, face drawn. We can't be letting stowaways out here, could we? The idea was absurd. No one could survive these conditions. We slowed the train further, to a near crawl. The lights on top of some cars let us glimpse fleeting shapes scuttling along the edges, tall, gaunt silhouettes. Passengers? No. This was a freight run, no passengers. The guys in the front boxcar radioed they saw hands or claw-like appendages pressing against the frosted windows, as though trying to get in. Baxter and I exchanged terrified looks. What the hell is out there? A haunting wail echoed through the storm. It sounded neither like wind nor man, but a collective moan, laced with sorrow and hunger. The overhead lights flickered inside the locomotive. The radio crackled with frantic voices, their pounding on the doors. Something, oh God, it's like hands beating on the metal. They're trying to get in. My chest pounded. We had to keep moving. If we stopped, we'd be overrun. By what? My mind conjured stories of Lake Michigan's watery graves, all the lost sailors from centuries of shipwrecks. Could these be their restless spirits, awakened by our trespass? The monstrous storm hammered us, as if fueling them. As we advanced, the knocking spread from the last cars forward, traveling car to car. Screams erupted over the radio. Henry's gone. The doors opened to the outside. Oh God, another wave of static. Baxter cursed, slamming the throttle. But the locomotive could only do so much on shaky rails laid over ice. If we sped too fast, we risked derailment into the lake's icy depths. The train rattled and swayed, a metal beast in mortal danger. Suddenly, the side window at the locomotive's cab banged from outside. Baxter yelped, brandishing a wrench. I nearly dropped my radio. A shape pressed to the glass, a pale face waterlogged, hair clinging to a rotted scalp, eyes wide with eternal horror. It stared at us, lips parted in a silent scream. Then it vanished in a swirl of snow. The radio squealed with feedback. They're the drowned sailors, I realized with bone-deep terror. They want to drag us down, to share their watery grave. The hammering resumed at the locomotive's roof, frantic. We heard scraping of nails or claws on metal. Faster! I shouted. Baxter was already pushing the engine. The train lurched, wheels squealing. The storm battered us, wind so fierce the windows threatened to crack. We prayed the ice track held. The entire train swayed side to side, so violent the overhead lights blinked in and out. Each second, we braced for the sound of splitting ice. Meanwhile, the knocks from outside grew louder, as if a legion hammered in unison. A fleeting glance out the front window, among the swirling snow, I saw elongated silhouettes pacing us, running across the ice with impossible speed, eyes glowing with a sickly light. They wanted our train to fail, to plunge under the ice and fill the lake with fresh souls to join them in the cold black. We had maybe 15 miles left to the shoreline. Could we last that long? Over the radio, static. Then Philip's voice, ragged, we can't hold them. Doors are buckling. The men in the middle cars are gone, then silence. The floor vibrated as something heavy landed on the locomotive roof, metal buckling overhead. I froze. Baxter locked eyes with me, white with terror. The roof screeched, as if claws tore at it. Then a window behind us shattered, shards flying. The cabin filled with freezing air. A shape lunged halfway in, pale arms slick with water, a face contorted in a drowned grin. I grabbed a crowbar from the floor, swung blindly. The shape shrieked, a wet, gurgling sound. Then it jerked away, out into the storm. A furious wail reverberated across the ice, joined by dozens more. The entire train was under siege. The locomotive's wheels spun, losing traction for a sickening second. But Baxter coaxed them back, inch by inch. We felt the rails below shift with a cracking groan. I thought we were done for, but the train somehow stayed upright, forging ahead. The final stretch was a blur of fear, me pressing the crowbar to guard the shattered window, Baxter wrestling the controls, the wails of lost sailors echoing outside. The overhead lights flickered in time with each monstrous thump on the metal frame. Then, unbelievably, we spotted land ahead, a dark silhouette of a harbor, the lights of a cargo yard. Our makeshift track ended there, the ice receding near the shoreline. The train roared forward, as if the engine itself yearned for safety. Another wave of pounding on the locomotive's side threatened to tip us. The swirling shape screeched, frantic to stop us from escaping. But the locomotive leapt onto firmer ground, wheels hitting actual rails on land with a mighty jolt. We cleared the ice. The battered train slowed, coasting into the yard. The wailing behind us receded, as though the ghosts could not step onto solid soil. The monstrous silhouettes melted into the distance, leaving only swirling snow illuminated by the yard lights. We halted. The yard staff rushed over, horrified at the train's damaged state. They found me and Baxter huddled in the cab, half frozen, the cabin's interior battered, seats ripped, shards of glass everywhere. The rest of the train was worse. Car after car empty, doors ripped open, no sign of the crew. Phillips, Henry, Nolan, all gone. The yard staff demanded explanations. We could only babble about the monstrous drowned spirits on the lake, how they hammered on the train, dragging men out into the storm. No bodies, no footprints, just twisted metal and open doors. The official story pinned it on the storm, accidents, men possibly lost to the ice. But Baxter and I knew better. We saw the waterlogged faces at the window, heard the wails that preceded each disappearance. The company quietly suspended ice crossings, the route deemed too dangerous. But the public never learned the full truth, only rumors. Baxter and I parted ways, forever scarred. Now, months later, I still relive the nightmare whenever I hear the moan of wind against a sheet of ice. I see the drowned eyes pressed to the locomotive glass, hungry to pull us under. Some nights I wake sweating, expecting to hear that frantic knocking on my walls. But the memory is enough. Perhaps those lost sailors from sunken ships, their souls bound to Lake Michigan's icy depths, remain, waiting for the next foolhardy train that dares cross their domain on a winter night. If you ever see headlights of a freight on the lake's frozen surface, if you hear a faint knocking from outside in the swirling snow, be warned, the lake spirits still roam, searching for the living to drag down to the watery grave they can never leave. Because once they knock, your only hope is to outrun them on the ice, or your soul might join the legion of the drowned below. Story number 5. The Phantom Lights of Mojave. The rail line that snakes through the Mojave Desert has always felt like a precarious thread between realms, an iron artery crossing a landscape of stark extremes. Nights out here can drop to a bone-chilling cold that betrays the daytime scorch, and the wind often howls across dunes with a voice older than any living traveler. I've run trains for 15 years, and I'd gotten used to the hush of an empty desert night, the reflection of stars on rolling dunes. But last winter, I took a freight run across the Mojave under a moonless sky, and nothing has been the same since. They say there are places in the desert that swallow you whole, places where memory and reality twist. Now I know that's true. My name is Thomas Avila, and this is my account of the night the desert almost claimed our train and our souls. I was assigned to a short freight run out of Barstow, heading west toward a yard near the California-Nevada border, with supplies that needed delivering before dawn. The cargo was standard, construction materials, a few containers of miscellaneous goods. We had a small crew, just me as engineer, my buddy Carl in the cab with me, and a brakeman named Dylan riding in the rear. The yard manager said we'd have a calm night, no major storms predicted, just a stiff wind. Typical desert winter, with the temperature dropping fast after sundown. We rolled out around 8 p.m. The train, a modest engine with half a dozen cars, rumbled onto the main line. We watched the orange glow of Barstow fade behind us, the desert's darkness swallowing everything. Headlights carved a path across the desert floor, revealing cacti and scrub for an instant before they slid away into blackness. Overhead, the sky was huge, a dome of stars that made me feel small. The rails clicked beneath us in that hypnotic lull I'd grown to love. By 10, we'd put miles behind us, the hush of the Mojave enveloping the train. Occasionally, a coyote's distant howl or a swirl of dust in the headlights reminded us we weren't alone. Carl kept the radio chatter minimal, listening for dispatcher instructions. Static mostly. Dylan in the rear texted us a few times complaining about boredom. Then we lost cell signal entirely, typical for these remote stretches. The hum of the engine, the steady speed of about 40 miles per hour, everything was normal. Then, just shy of midnight, we saw the first glow on the horizon. At first, I thought it was the faint light of some distant rest stop or ranch. But as we drew closer, the glow became more distinct, 3 or 4 bobbing lights, like lanterns, hovering just above the rails. Carl squinted, confusion etched on his face. We heard stories of spook lights in the desert, illusions from pockets of swamp gas or weird reflections. But this was no swamp. The lights danced in a row, flickering a deep bluish hue. They reminded me of will-o'-the-wisps, except we were in the Mojave. We slowed the train as we approached. The lights hovered maybe 200 yards ahead on the tracks, almost beckoning. Then, as if noticing us, they winked out. The night swallowed them. Carl exhaled a nervous chuckle. "Desert illusions," he muttered. But goosebumps rose on my arms. Something felt wrong, like those lights were aware. We rumbled onward, the desert wind picking up. Snow rarely falls in the Mojave, but winter storms can blow in freak conditions. The temperature outside dipped to near freezing. A mild dusting of sand began swirling in the headlights, but it didn't hamper visibility too much. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled with a voice, "Engine, this is Station 10. You have a signal to hold." Over. Station 10? That made no sense. Our line had no station labeled 10 out here. Carl and I exchanged a glance. The voice repeated, "Signal to hold. Danger on track." The sound was distorted, muffled, as though from an old analog system. I keyed the mic, asked the dispatcher for confirmation. No response. Just static. Another hiss, then the same voice, more urgent, "Stop the train now. This is official order." Then silence. I slowed our speed. The track ahead looked fine on the monitors, no sign of a blocked route. The instrument said we were clear. Yet the voice insisted we stop. Could it be a hoax? We debated ignoring it, but caution won out. I braked gently, bringing the train to a halt on the open desert track. The quiet that followed felt surreal. Dylan radioed from the rear, "What's going on?" We explained. He was as confused as us. Then, in the swirl of the locomotive's headlights, a figure emerged from the darkness at the trackside, a man in a railroad uniform, or so it seemed, stepping onto the rails. The reflective stripes on his vest glowed faintly. He lifted a lantern, motioning for us to remain still. I muttered, "We expecting a track worker?" Carl shook his head. No calls about maintenance. Yet there he stood, beckoning, eyes shadowed under his cap. I slid open the side window, leaning out. "Hey, you from the railroad?" I shouted. The figure nodded slowly. The wind snatched away any words he tried to speak. We told Dylan to check from his vantage. Over radio, Dylan said no one was on the manifest for track workers. Alarm bells went off in my mind. The figure gestured again, as if urging us off the train. Carl was about to step outside, but something in me said no. My gut twisted. "Stay put," I hissed. "This doesn't feel right." The figure's face was half lit by the train's beam. I saw hollowness in his cheeks, pallor in his skin, eyes that glowed faintly. He raised his lantern overhead, swinging it in a slow circle. "A sign to disembark?" I shook my head at Carl, who looked spooked. The figure suddenly let out a silent scream, mouth opening wide, no sound. Then he vanished, as if blown away by a gust of wind. Our hearts pounded. We reeled from the impossible. "We gotta move," I managed, voice shaking. Carl nodded vigorously. I applied throttle. The train jerked forward on the rails. But the wheels spun, the steel squealing, as though the rails were slick with something. It took a moment for traction to catch. The overhead lights in the cab flickered, an oppressive sense of dread pressing on me. The radio crackled again with the same distorted voice, "Stay, or face the storm." Then static. A wave of fear overcame me, but we pressed onward. The locomotive rumbled into the swirling desert night, leaving that eerie spot behind. We got maybe a mile further when the wind kicked into overdrive, hurling sand and grit against the windows and a crescendo of rattles. The darkness thickened. The onboard instrumentation flickered, compasses spinning. Then, from behind us, a furious pounding on the exterior of the locomotive, like fists hammering metal. Dylan radioed, panicked, "Something's on top of the last car." I can hear banging. My stomach lurched. We were in the middle of nowhere, moving at 20 miles per hour. Who or what could climb on? We slowed again, uncertain, but decided to keep crawling forward. The pounding spread along the cars, as if multiple fists rained blows. Or was it hail? No, hail doesn't sound like deliberate knocks. In the side mirror, I glimpsed shadows scuttling along the side of the freight cars, half glimpsed in the swirling dust. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Drifters? Impossible. Then a deep moaning sound rose outside, as though the desert itself was crying out. A sand-laced wind battered us, a near blizzard of dust and grit. The lights from the locomotive barely cut through it, revealing shifting shapes that might have been tumbleweeds or something else. Carl cursed, "We gotta outrun this." He advanced the throttle. The train's engine roared, wheels slipping but eventually finding traction, pushing us to maybe 30 miles per hour. The sand battered the windows, scraping them raw, producing a high screech. The overhead lights flickered. My radio beeped, an incoming call. It was Dylan, voice trembling, the last car's door just flung open from outside. I see lights. Or eyes. I can't be sure. They're inside the car, man. I'm hearing footsteps. Then the transmission cut. I tried to respond, only static. The train thundered forward, the desert storm intensifying. This was no normal wind. It churned like a vortex, swirling around the train. Then, in a flash of lightning, yes, desert storms sometimes brew lightning in dust storms, I saw them, silhouettes of men in old naval coats. No, that made no sense. Or were they wearing some archaic attire? My mind reeled. They flickered in the dust, arms outstretched, moaning. The radio crackled with a new voice. "We are the drowned, lost in the dunes." It made no sense. Drowned in the desert? Then I recalled legends. The Mojave once had ancient lakebeds, ships that sank in ephemeral seas. Could these be old spirits from a time beyond memory? Again, the pounding resumed on our locomotive. A door behind us rattled. Carl and I spun, bracing it with our shoulders. Something battered from the outside, each thud shaking the entire engine. We felt cold seeping in, as if the storm carried a supernatural chill. The voice on the radio, deep and distant, demanded, "Join us, the desert takes all." I clung to reason, refusing to open that door. The train wheels squealed, forging onward across invisible rails. A final slam cracked the door's hinges. For a split second, I glimpsed a ghostly figure, face gaunt, eyes milky, wearing a tattered railroad uniform from decades past. He reached for me with clawed fingers, swirling dust forming his body. I lashed out with a wrench. The figure dissipated into swirling sand, letting out a furious hiss. The wind howled louder, as though the entire storm raged at our defiance. In that moment, the train cleared a ridge, the desert slope descending. We spotted faint lights of a distant yard or station. The swirling shapes around us howled in despair, the knocks subsiding. The storm parted enough for us to see normal rails again. Our momentum carried us out of the vortex's heart. The moaning voices receded. I radioed Dylan frantically, no reply. Fear gnawed me. Then, after excruciating minutes, he answered in a weak voice, "I'm alive." They took Henry. I saw him vanish into sand. I can't find him. My heart sank. Another life lost. At last, we reached the outskirts of a small rail yard near the state line. The storm behind us diminished into an ominous swirl. We rolled into a siding, panting. Yard workers rushed over, alarmed at our battered, dust-scraped cars. We stumbled out, searching the freight cars. We found some open, cargo half-strewn. No sign of Henry. The yard staff took statements. Their faces said they didn't believe half of what we said, chalking it up to a freak sandstorm. But Carl, Dylan, and I knew the truth. Something out there in the Mojave, ancient spirits, or ghostly watchers, tried to claim us. The official record stated one crewman disappeared in the storm. The company quietly ended the practice of shipping materials by crossing that desert line at night in winter. I left the job soon after. Too many nightmares. Sometimes I dream of swirling dust forming humanoid shapes, banging on metal walls, moaning for new souls. The Mojave's winter nights remain a realm of swirling illusions, or maybe something more. I warn anyone crossing those tracks, if you see strange lights on the rails, or hear a phantom knock at your train car door, do not answer. Because the ghosts of lost travelers, or perhaps ancient desert spirits, still roam, beckoning the living to join them beneath the dunes, forever lost in the swirling dust of a never-ending storm. If you don't outrun them, you may find your train car empty come morning, your name added to the desert's legion of missing.